My name's Colin Gallaugher. As I've just heard the intro, it's better than I actually thought I was. Really good. What I'm basically going to do is, you probably had some presentations earlier on some of the new build. Mine's very much going to be focused on sustainable buildings, actually where we actually have existing stock and what we actually do if there's an occasion of flood, and actually how we mitigated it slightly and how we reacted actually to the flood occasion that we had when we went through a period of incessant rainfall and high ground level waters, and obviously those two actually cause a problem actually when we've got residents. The area I'm focusing on very much is obviously pictures, we'll pick those up later anyway. Is Buckskin. Buckskin's an area within Basingstoke. I don't know if any of you from the south actually, and Buckskin we have typically about 5,000 properties, of which 40 sit basically in a valley, very much actually within a small valley actually we have in Basingstoke. It wasn't typically considered a floodplain or a floodplain area, but during the floods, you may recall during 2014 we had horrendous levels of rainfall, actually occurred quite a lot. That coupled with a river, very much the River Lavant, which was very much underneath some of the properties that we had. Mixture of two created a situation where we had excessive flood. Flood rose really quickly. Reaction time for a housing association, our housing association, was very difficult to mitigate that, so we moved straight away into crisis management. So again, this presentation will pick up very much how we can move away a little bit from crisis management. I don't think actually you can really stop a flood. If it's going to rain, it's going to rain. But what you can do is if there's an occasion of flood and your houses your unfortunate houses aren't on top of a hill and actually you're close to a river, then there's a tendency very much that you need to actually react or have some plan in place to actually react. To actually offer reassurance to the residents that we have actually in that particular area as well, because it's quite traumatic when you're actually living or you're existing obviously for a flood. And the other aspect I think also is obviously mitigation with regard to insurance claims and actually where we sit with regard to that and logistics side of it. The Buckskin, or the case actually that we did, and I'm going to talk about very much, there was 40 odd properties. Again, that's probably involved potentially up to 100 people actually that we had to move. We had to move out of their properties actually where they were flooded. The approximate cost of the flood, everything, which is hotel expenditure, void works, inspections, PPE kit, flood equipment, engagement with the local services, was about 2.5 million over a period of time. So for us, 41 properties, 2.5 million. The investment aspect is really rubbish. Very much when you're looking at what could we do to actually try and reduce some of this. And as I said earlier, you can't stop a flood effectively unless you actually relocate and actually plan where your building is actually going to be placed. But what you can do is maybe mitigate some of the damage that a flood occurs. I think which we did, so after the flood, we basically took a view when the floods actually occurred and actually moved people out. And as I said, we went into crisis management. So we generally set up an action plan in a community hall. We had a lot of residents asking a lot of questions. So very much there's a cultural aspect to the flood as well. Where am I going to go? What's happening to all my stuff? What's going to happen? Will my kids go to school? So all this side of it, very much as a housing association, is quite a key driver for us as an organisation, because generally very much actually part of our role within housing isn't just to supply the property, but also is actually supply a service to our residents as well. So what we initially did, once the flood occurred, and actually we did the damage limitation bit and we located and moved people out and put them in hotels, we had voided properties. Then it was part of the clean-up. The flood still hadn't abated, so we had to wait for at least 2 weeks with the residents out of the properties, wait for the water to go down. And bearing in mind, we had lots of tankers there as well, but it was carrying on raining, so again, you couldn't actually stop it. So very much we were sucking the water out, and as soon as we sucked it out, obviously the water came back in again. And a lot of it, to be fair, we came across and we were reinventing the wheel an awful lot. There is a lot of information around actually in our sector very much now, but as a housing association it wasn't something that we've probably experienced to that level anyway, and I think the only reason we did was primarily because of the really bad weather that we had, and we would not have gone down this road if it never happened. So because of that, very much we reinvented the wheel, so we created a gold plan which we would generally use for fire issues or massive, or when you have other occasions actually with regard to global chaos or catastrophe actually within the housing association. So some of the very much we relied on that. We relied very much on the experience some of our surveyors actually very much within the property. We worked very closely with Environmental Agency, worked very closely with some of the other central agencies as well, highways. But what we then did, when the floodwaters did abate, we then went into the properties and we started doing the inspection, which was horrendous, because the other aspect, again, which comes up, and I'll pick up the point, I think some of the aspects when we are looking at property level protection measures, I mean, some of the things we actually ruled out, and we said, well, actually, we won't bother replacing the skirting boards, because actually what's happened during the flood, when the water went down, the sewage all rose, so all your skirting boards were contaminated. Yeah, we can raise the electrical sockets and we can do some of the other work as well, but effectively everything on the ground floor had to be thrown away, chucked away, and actually you had to bring in brand new. So we did the flood survey along with our insurance assessors as well, because again, this hurt us on our insurance premiums quite highly. Obviously, when we went to it for $2.5 million, I don't think there's a lot of insurance companies that can probably wear that. So again, we picked up an awful lot of the management time in there, working out actually what work was needed to actually get these places and these empty properties back up to scratch again so the residents can move in as quick as possible. But also, could we take the opportunity while we've got an empty building or an empty property to actually put some stuff in there, so actually if it does happen again, let's make the most of it. So we could do some measures, and I've picked up earlier on another slide, where you can do some sealing in on the substrate level of the floor, so you can actually seal it in, so if anything does happen, non-return valves you can put in on the sewage aspects. So there are stuff and measures you can put in place. But again, it's effectively, this is just mitigation. It isn't stopping the flood. So there's not a lot of you can actually do with regards to that. Again, picking up the other point as well, one of the other pressures we had wasn't just cost, obviously was the residents very much that, okay, you're a housing association and this is my property, what are you doing to stop it happening again? So it's really giving them a bit of communication as well and reassurance that if something like this happens again, very much we need to create an action plan or a team, which we did, stakeholders primarily all involved within that action team, of which residents were included as well. So we took on board some of the experiences that they had, which they could identify as actually ways to improve things as well. So going back to the last point, actually, was implementing property level protection, which I think is probably the area that we focused on very much. Like I said, we couldn't do anything fundamentally to change the design of the buildings because actually they're already built, and they're already built in a location that you wouldn't if you had a clean piece of paper, you would say, I would not build there. I'd actually move it 10 miles away on top of a hill. But again, I think very much from where we were. So it's very much looking at measures that we can actually apply to the properties that we actually had. So the ones that we did, I don't know if you can all see these, so I'll call them out at the back, unless your eyesight's brilliant. So we mastic around the bottom level, actually damp DPC and above. Actually, we included that side of it. Any areas that you got any entries within the property on low level, so we actually put mastic around the whole side of it. And again, this is very much BSI kite mastic. It was in line, obviously, that it would almost tank in, but it's on the outside of a building rather than on the inside. We did obviously the outside as well, and the garages. Non-return valves, foul drainage, very much on some of the properties which are on the outside. We could actually swap those over and change them. Two-part epoxy damp, so we put the membranes on the inside of the property again. Waterproof sealant, anti-flood air bricks, really clever, probably about the only tech bit that we had on these properties, very much. As soon as there's flood comes up, then the flood air bricks actually close down really quickly. Repoint all low-level mortar joints, again, I think is some of the properties, because they're quite old, you wouldn't necessarily focus on that as a surveyor or part of your stock investment, or let's repoint all the bottom areas in case there's a flood, so you wouldn't do it. But because of this, we did. Flood barriers, which is probably the biggest investment that we did, was actually on the flood barriers aspect. So again, some of these properties had 2 or 3 doors, back door, side door, and you've got a front entrance as well. So it's flood barriers, and again, that was a whole mission on itself. I mean, very much with the flood barrier is some of our residents are elderly. They can't lift up something that weighs about 8 kilos quite easily. And once you put it in, you can't expect your resident to jump over it, to come in and out if the flood doesn't carry on or the threat of flood isn't there. So we needed very much a program or an action plan of when we implemented some of these measures. The rest of the stuff I was saying previously is solid state. It's pretty well in there. You're not going to change it much. The ones actually that you would do in the event of a flood, which you really have to do if you're looking at PLP properly, is actually as the flood barriers. Actually, you probably need them in place as well. We also created a flood action group. Again, as I said, we was really focused on very much including some of the residents in there. Whilst the residents' construction knowledge is pretty minimal, but they could give us some advice very much and input related to actually, well, if I'm going to a hotel, can we make sure it's these type of hotels? Or if I've got children, can you cater for this aspect? Or if you've got a community centre, can it be local or closer? So some of those areas very much we included in that, which was probably not necessarily your more techie pieces. We obviously had the surveyors and we had technical excellence actually within our organisation along with the local council. We involved highways in there. And again, we also involved in there community representatives as well, because we involved police again on some of these areas very much. We had to close roads off, we had to close the whole area off, so we needed some of the disaster planning aspect. We're very much primary for driving that as a flood action group, and we still use that because again, moving forward, you've got to look at a sustainable approach to this as well. Whilst we've got PLP set in there, we've got some barriers sorted, we also now got to look at how we're going to manage this on the maintenance approach actually going forward. We do a biannual readiness trial, which is related to the barriers. And as I said before, the barriers is quite a challenge in itself, is you don't generally want to put the barriers in place until a flood is imminent. And so the timing has got to be quite good. So on that basis, with our own team, we created obviously a gold action plan, effectively if it's flood. So it's early warning, relies very much on early warning. So from the national rivers, we get updates in our particular areas or locations where we perceive there to be a flood risk. On the basis of that, we then monitor it. We then monitor the weather, we monitor the river levels. And actually on the basis of that, if we decide there's actually going to be a big issue related to flood imminently, we will then go through actually evacuating residents in certain areas that we've got. Bearing in mind this is a catastrophic incident, and if it happens again, we'd have to do that because if there's no flood and the residents come back, well, what the hell was that for then? Along with the cost. So very much it's a case of managing that and being quite clear what our threshold or triggers levels are regarding to go into a flood event. Once we do a flood event, then we've got it down to 40 properties which are at risk ones. We've got it down that we can probably install the barriers in about an hour and a half with our team. So we've got them located quite closely, they're all labelled up, the guys know exactly what they're going to do, they're going to go in and out and actually place them in there. And if residents start seeing the barriers going in, then know there's going to be a flood very quickly and they've got to get out of the house fairly quickly. And we got arrangements with local hotels in the event that we need a high demand actually of hotels, which typically we would do. So we created a barrier flood response team again, but it's very much a biannual one. So we do a scenario planning. We won't pick all 40 properties, but we'll advise the residents this is what we're doing. And we're going to do it in the spring and we'll do it in the winter. And what we'll do is actually just pick up 10 properties and just go through the process of are our action plans updated, do the telephone numbers work, are the same people in the right place actually that we wanted as well. And is the garage still available? Is it still open or has it been vandalised? So some of this investment is ongoing. It isn't just a one-off. And again, it's very much picking up. If there are other opportunities for better products out there, then that's something that this flood action group would also look at as well. Obviously, weekly monitoring ground during the periods when we would consider inclement weather. And also, the other aspect that we also picked up, which was a challenge for us, and it was a contributing factor without a doubt, is the fact that we didn't do a lot of investment related to clearing the soakaways actually in some of the properties, getting rid of the bracken and the rubbish that generally lies around there with regard from the trees, or where you've got some rubble that might collect and actually might clog up some of your drains. So it's very much as that whole process in an area is looking at gully clearance. And obviously impact assessment on new developments. As I said earlier, really I think for new properties, a lot of it, your flood resilience measures very much are picked up and identified at planning level. So at planning stage, you would probably get the not go ahead, don't build here, please, because it's a floodplain, and don't. So very much from that aspect, you would hope actually that you don't on new build as a new property, because Sovereign Housing Association, we build typically 1,000 homes probably a year as a housing association. So very much from our perspective, it's really important that actually we're not building and creating problems for the future. So we would look at ways to actually avoid that through a flood impact assessment. So yeah, I mean, essentially it would have been great to have central funding for a lot of this that we did. We didn't get it. I think they're quite robust aspects that we needed to do, and we didn't do it in time because as a housing association we had to follow those timelines anyway, guidelines for tendering and going through that process. So it was probably beneficial that we took a view very much that whilst there may have been central funding available for this, we weren't able to actually get it. But what we did take the view very much as an organisation, we're still going to invest in it irrespective of government funding. So we actually made a case actually of budgetary within our year to actually spend the amount of money we needed to spend to actually make sure that it mitigated some of the floods actually we experienced as well. So we looked at it as an investment really. It cost us about 130,000 for about 41 properties, and that involves the labour to actually do the painting, do the decorating, the surveyors actually that we needed in there, clearing out all of the drains, getting the non-return valves in there, very much getting the surveyors in there and actually getting the buy-in from the insurance company as well. Because again, the insurance company were really useful for us on this. Obviously they've vested interest, they don't want to spend money. But again, it was very much a win-win for both of us, that they would advise us some aspects to actually do and we would then say, yep, we're going to go with that, or no, we're not going to do that. So very much it was really good having that close discussion or close debate with regard to insurance and other stakeholders. Generally, and some of that 130k also involves the management time involved with it, with implementing it, engaging with the residents aspect as well. And it was about 7 to 10k roughly for our sustainability aspects as well, getting the DLO out, doing the sample, doing the scenarios. And again, we're aware of it, so we budget for it. Took 3 months, the initial one, to do all the work that we needed on there to carry out on the 40 properties that we had. And obviously it's a high investment management time as well at front end. Once it's in place and you have your plans in place and you've done your case study and you've done your scenario setting, you had your flood action group, then it's pretty well rolls on itself. And it's really, and I can't really overstress it too much, I think it's really important that for us as an organisation, it is really beneficial for the scenario, they're doing it once, twice a year. Because not only does it actually help make sure that if people come and go with an organisation, which is quite frequent, ensures your process procedures are up to date as well, if you're ISO. But the other main thing I think for me on something like that, it just creates that awareness within the organisation that if there's a flood event, you need to be really fully aware of all the things that could happen. So I think very much for me, very much more of a cultural aspect as well, as I mentioned earlier. The outcomes of our PLP and the work that we did, residents were reassured, probably not 100% because they realised we can't stop a flood. I mean, it's not going to happen. But what we can do is actually mitigate some of the damage that floods cause. Relies very much on cross-organisational teamwork. So within a housing association, if some of you are familiar with housing associations, we have housing, property, we have health and safety, and we have other aspects of the team. So very much that it helped and it created a situation that we created a group that when it wasn't just property alone, you look after the buildings, so it's your issue. It's actually not, because the issue related amongst residents that we had to vacate as well, we need to involve the whole of the department and the team along with finance. Because again, one of the key things we just basically, and it really is ABC stuff, you'd think actually well, everyone would know that, but not everybody does, so we created a process for it. Is every expenditure you do during a flood, make a record of it, because you can't claim it back otherwise from insurance. So it's very much as this sort of ABC stuff that you need to do, and not everybody is fully cognizant of what you need to do and the requirements to do it. Obviously, improved response to a flood event. We now know if something happens, what we need to do, how we need to do it. So rather than making it up as we go along, very much on there and causing, to be fair, some potentially dangerous situations. We had people with the floods for the best will walking down roads in waders to try and get to a resident. But of course in a flood event you could actually have the drain cover could float off or could come up, or for whatever reason you do not know what you're walking on, you don't know if there's a curb, you don't know you're walking through sewage. So there's a lot of issues I think generally that it probably helps to be aware of actually if there is a flood event, what we're going to do and how we're going to react to it. So rather than make it up as we go along, actually we've got the answers for that. We got increased measures, obviously resilience for properties with regard to actually how we do it now, and obviously that's one of the barriers that we got. And again, this issue, and while I was saying going back earlier, it's probably a continuous process. It's not just a one-off, and there has to be sustainability, especially with the flood action group. The weather's not going to get any better generally if you're looking at a climate and how it's going to go. Winters typically aren't cold, where down in the south normally they're very wet, and the wet part of it's getting worse. And of course, there's tendency of something like this happening because, as I said earlier, the houses aren't going anywhere. It could happen again, and I think very much it's that process of being fully aware of that. And the reason why I think it worked with us and why we did do the investment of the 100 odd K on there was very much that Senior management fully realised and bought into very much the ownership of this, the importance that we need to do on it as well. Because again, in a housing association, some of our board members are residents. So again, we very much felt the pain very, very directly, actually, with regard to that. So it was willing to invest, and we were going to do that irrespective of any government funding that we had available. Prior to the demands, the resident very much that's looking at opportunities where we actually involve residents in some of the areas and aspects of what we wanted to do with PLP. And generally, it's reviewing what we do going forward annually, whether the Flood Action Group meets again twice a year. And this is probably our flood experience from where we go. These are probably awful pictures, and probably you've seen loads of pictures like this already earlier. And you probably see some later today anyway. So that's probably not too bad one. That's a pathway, actually, it's covered water. It starts going up a bit more. This is quite fortunate. This resident had a high wall, actually, but unfortunately the high wall had a load of holes in it. So the water went through when it raised above there. So actually the high wall didn't protect them much and the water went through. And again, you can see slight incline down there with a dip. Residents, obviously, that flood again had abated, but it was still going, obviously, it was into the residents. The sandbags, to be fair, didn't help one bit. Went straight through the UPVC, went straight through above the DPC, and went through the holes that we had in the properties as well. Again, we were tankering as much as we could, but as soon as we did it, it flooded and it rained again, and it went on for an incessant period of typically weeks. And all that work, to be fair, because sewage had come up, anywhere where that water had got into property had to be cleared, had to be cleaned. It was contaminated, so we had to change it all. So 41 homes flooded, and as I say, you already mentioned that. That's a BMW, actually, I think. No, Mazda, and that's well above the wheel arches on there as well. So it wasn't just the houses, to be fair, that were damaged. And this is probably the biggest, worst one I've got. We've got ducks floating actually on our estates. Actually, it was really quite interesting. That brings me to the end. Actually, if there's any questions, obviously we'd now do the workshop bit, I guess. So I'm quite free to take on any questions. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. And it's just an opportunity to actually share some of our experiences actually from a flood event that we had as well. So thank you.